All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. As Julia said, my name is Kira, and I am uh, here to talk about vultures. I am not an expert about vultures, but I consider myself very much a vulture enthusiast. Right now, I'm working on getting my master's degree through the University of Ohio. No, Miami University of Ohio, excuse me. And part of that was actually doing some research on vultures. So I will be sharing a little bit of the research that I've done, but primarily we're just going to be talking about vultures and with a specific look at vultures throughout the world and really within the United States, because I think that's most of the people who will be joining and watching this. So let's go ahead and talk about some vultures. So first of all, go ahead and type in the chat. What kind of words do you think of when you think of vultures? What comes to mind? And please feel free also throughout my whole thing to type any questions in at any point. All right, I see the word death, scavenger, fantastic. These are good words. Anything else that comes to mind? Roadkill, cleaner, excellent words. Barf defense, yeah, we'll talk about that. That's a good one. Those are some really good words. Feel free to keep popping them in there. I might not be able to see all of them as you do, but feel free to put them in there. Those are all really good words. Unfortunately, in our media, vultures are often portrayed as scary or harbingers of death, gross, or opportunistic. They don't really get a very good rap in our culture. And so one of the things I wanted to look at with my research was how vultures were perceived. So I actually asked that same question in an anonymous survey, and this is a visual representation of what words were taken. And so with the words on this page that you're seeing here, the bigger the words are, the more often they were said. So you can see scavenger is the most common word that comes up when people think of vultures, and there's quite a variety of other things that people think of. There's a lot of negative things: dead, death, gross, garbage, unsanitary, morbid, things like that. And then if you look closer, there's also some pretty good things in there, like they're important, they are helpful, majestic. So there's a lot of really interesting things that people think when thinking about vultures. Now, I will say this survey was probably slightly skewed because it was a lot of people that were from environmental organizations, so it might be on the more positive trend than what might be of the typical population. But one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about vultures is because people need to know how important they are and how wonderful they are. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to learn about some vultures. And so let's kind of rewind a little bit and talk about what makes a vulture a vulture. There are essentially 4 distinct things that make a vulture, distinct from other birds of prey that could be in the same group. One is that they have long hooked bills designed for tearing food. They are almost all going to be eating meat of some sort, and so that hooked bill is going to help them rip and tear things. They also, for the most part, are going to lack feathering on their heads. There are a couple exceptions that we'll talk about tonight, but that is typically going to be the case for vultures. And the lack of feathering on their heads is actually there to help them stay clean, because they often stick their heads into carcasses and into meat to rip and tear. And so they don't want all of the blood and guts and bacteria on their feathers. And so the lack of feather makes it so that those things can't adhere to them as easily, and it makes it easier for them to clean off too. And then they also lack powerful feet, characteristic of eagles, hawks, and owls. This is because they are not using their feet to kill or to hold on to live things like eagles, hawks, and owls might be doing. They mostly use their feet to hold on to whatever they're eating so that it can stay still while they rip it, or to help them walk around and perch. So they don't need as strong as feet as the eagles, hawks, and owls that are closely related to them. And then they are mostly scavengers. So they're mostly eating dead things. That, again, is not true of all vultures. We'll talk about a couple of the exceptions tonight. But for the most part, they are going to be eating carrion or things that are already dead. They typically do not kill things before they eat it. They find stuff that was recently killed and then, or recently died, and then they eat it. Now, there are two main groups of vultures in the world. We've got Old World vultures and New World vultures. Old World vultures are going to be in the family called Accipitiridae, and that is along with hawks, eagles, and kites. They are found in Europe, Asia, and Africa. And there are 16 species within the Old World group. And they are, of those 16 species, only 2 of them are not in trouble as far as their populations go. So only 2 are considered least concern on the IUCN, which is the International Union of Conservationists, on that list, which goes from least concern to extinct. And there are only 2 that are least concerned of the 16 species. The rest of them are somewhere between threatened and critically endangered. So a lot of those species are in trouble. We'll talk about a couple of them and why tonight as well. And then our New World vultures are going to be in a completely different family called Cathartidae, and they are found in the Americas, so only in North and South America. There are no vultures in Australia, so we won't talk about any of those today. They're only found within the Africa, Europe, Asia, America, North and South America. And our New World vultures are North and South America. And there are only 7 species of New World vultures. And of those 7, only 2 are in danger for their populations. The rest of them are least concern. So there's less concern of vultures in the United States and within South America than the rest of the world. And we will talk about why. But first, I want to talk about the kind of the genetics a little bit and how they are grouped, because it is very hotly contested. I have a big kind of square on here that shows the general area that we're talking about with vultures. There's been a lot of debate over the years as to where the New and Old World vultures belong, because they actually are not the same. It's an example of convergent evolution, which happens when things evolve on separate lines because they have similar shared ecology, similar niches that they're filling. So both groups of vultures are going to be filling that scavenger role, but they diverged evolutionarily pretty far back. So right now, as we understand it, which it could definitely change because it's changed a lot, our Old World vultures are in this Accipitiformes group, which is going to be with our hawks, eagles, owls, kites, or not owls, sorry, Strigiformes is owls. But our hawks, eagles, and kites are going to be in the same group as our Old World vultures, whereas the New World vultures are going to be in the Cathartiformes right here. Previously, we used to think that Old World vultures were actually related to storks. So they were in a family called Ciconidae. And then after that, they were thought to be actually closer related to falcons and the Falconiformes. And the most recent evolutionary discoveries have shown that they're more closely related in this group to Carassiformes, which are kingfishers, Strigiformes, owls, Accipitiformes, eagles, kites, and hawks, than they are anywhere else. So they've been kind of grouped into this group, but they did diverge pretty far in history from our other vultures, which is kind of interesting that they ended up in similar places and similarly looking, even though they're not really closely related to each other. All right. I'm going to dive into some Old World vultures and just give you a quick snapshot of all 16 species. And then I'm just going to pick a couple of them for us to talk about after that, because we don't have time to talk about every species today. I wish we did. But here we go. We've got a palm nut vulture, bearded, Egyptian, red-headed, white-headed, cinereous, lappet-faced, hooded, white-backed, white-rumped, Indian, slender-billed, Rupauls griffin, Himalayan griffin, Eurasian griffin, and Cape griffin. So those are all of our
Here, I believe we just lost you right after you finished with the Cape Griffin.
Oh no. How did you, can you see it now?
Yes, we can see it, but we couldn't hear you.
Oh, okay. Let me go back then. Cape, you said Cape Griffin. Cool. Well then, you saw all the vultures. Like I said, I wish we could talk about all of them, but we don't have time. So I'm just picking a couple that I think are really cool or that have some interesting things for us to know that kind of represent vulture populations. So the first one I wanted to talk about is a Rupauls griffin vulture. I have actually had the pleasure of working with some Rupauls griffin vultures at Greenville Zoo. I worked there for a while. These are critically endangered. They are found throughout the middle section of Africa. And they have had a 97% decline in their population since 1990, which is really significant. And the primary threats to our Rupauls griffin vultures are two types of poisoning. One is an unintentional poisoning through poison baits, and one is intentional poisoning through belief-based poisoning. So first of all, poison baits happen in this region of Africa, mostly because there are a lot of the time when cattle die or when an animal dies, it brings in other scavengers like hyenas. Yes.
It's still on your slide's still on the images of the different griffins.
Here, let me just stop sharing and start sharing it again because I don't know.
Apologize for the technical difficulties, everyone.
Let's see. Can we see it now?
It is different now, yes.
Okay. Tell me if there's any other issues, but so we've got you can see the range there. In this region of Africa, we got the poison baits and the belief-based baits, intentional poisoning. So our poison baits happen when like a cattle or some other animal dies and it brings in scavengers like hyenas, lions, and things that people don't want around them. So to get rid of those, they often poison the carcass. And unfortunately, it usually kills vultures more than anything else. It does occasionally kill other scavengers that come in, but it mostly kills vultures, and vultures will feed in, especially this type of vultures will feed in large groups of up to 100. So it can kill hundreds of vultures all at once with those poisonings. So it's a really big deal when it happens, especially since their populations have declined so much. They're at a very critical point as to whether they can be saved or not. And then the intentional poisoning, which is belief-based poisoning, is that in Africa, there are parts of vultures that are used in medicines. And then there are also the same kind of beliefs that can generate throughout the world that kind of think they're harbingers of death and don't want anything to do with them. So they kill them whenever they see them. So they intentionally poison things that they eat to keep them away. So there's a lot of education-based conservation science going on to try and get people to change a little bit in their views and in their behaviors to stop poisoning vultures. But so kind of moving away from the sad part of our vultures, a fun fact about this species is that they are the highest flying bird in the world. They've been recorded at flying over 36,000 feet in the air, which is the same as airplanes. And that's actually how it was discovered. because somebody was in an airplane. I saw one, which is pretty cool. The reason that they're able to do that is because they have an alteration to one of their proteins that has not been found in any other bird species, and that allows them to be able to fly and breathe despite lower pressure and oxygen at those altitudes. Now they want to go that high because it helps them travel further faster. For every mile they go up in the sky, they can actually soar for 5 miles without flapping, and that is less energy. So the higher they can go, the further they can go. And then they also have excellent eyesight, so it helps them to be able to locate their food pretty easily. All right, any questions about Rupauls Griffin Vulture before I move on to our next one? Feel free to type them in, and Julia, feel free to stop me if one pops up because I want to give you time to do that. But I'm going to go to the next one, which is one of my favorite vultures. This is called the bearded vulture. You might be able to tell why. It's named after that kind of mustachioed, bearded, feathery bristles around its beak. And it is also sometimes called the lammergeier. They are near threatened and their populations are decreasing. They're found throughout different parts of Africa, Europe, and Asia. And a little fun fact about them is that they're the largest bird that is currently found in the Alps. Now, you can see that our bearded vulture here does not have the classic vulture bare head that a lot of vultures have, and that is because of their diet. And I've got a little fun comic here that shows what they eat. They are mostly going to be eating bones. So they wait for the vultures and other things to eat everything else from the carcass, and then they eat the bones, and they will eat bones and bone marrow. So their diet is dominated by between 70 to 90% of just eating bones. They will, if they're too big, as this comic suggests, they will fly up high and drop the bones on rocks to break them apart into pieces so that they can swallow them easier and to be able to get to the marrow as well. They have also been documented eating owl pellets to be able to just obtain the bones from within. And they also are one of the more colorful vultures with the colors that they've got going on. The most colorful vulture is a king vulture, but these guys are a close second. All right. Moving on to another vulture that is a little unique, also does not follow that feathered head or scavenger. This one's different. This is the palm nut vulture. This one's found throughout parts of Africa, and they are least concerned and their populations are stable. This is because they are very unlike other vultures, and as their name suggests, palm nut, they eat primarily palm fruits. So when they are juveniles, 92% of their diet's going to be palm fruits, and when they're an adult, it's between 58 to 65% of their diet. The remainder of their diet's going to be mostly small vertebrates and carrion, so they occasionally can catch things and before they die and eat them, small things. And then if they eat carrion, it's going to be small things that they eat, not large carrion. So because of their diet, they're not often found with other vultures, and they are unlikely to be persecuted because they're not really seen in that same group. And they have a largely vegetarian diet. So mostly people don't clump them in the same group as vultures and don't give them the same kind of don't try and target them for poisoning or anything like that. So it's a very different vulture species than any other vulture that we really know of, but they still fit in that group from their evolutionary history and the DNA that we've been able to study from them. All right, another one of my favorites are lappet-faced vultures. Lappet-faced vultures are named for the fleshy folds of skin called lappets that are on the side of their neck. They are very large vultures, one of the largest ones, and they are found, again, throughout Africa, a little bit into Asia, and they are endangered, and they've had 80% decline in their population over the last 20 years, and that has continued to decline. Their main threats are, again, poison baits, unintentional poisoning, and intentional poisoning, but the poisoning that's intentional is different for these guys. It's called sentinel poisoning, And that is a little different, and it's mostly poachers who are poisoning things. So when poachers kill something, they're usually leaving behind a body and just taking parts that they want from that animal. And so then groups of vultures would come in to eat it, and the groups of vultures could be so large that it would kind of alert the authorities to where poachers might be. So poachers caught on to that, and they wanted to stop vultures showing where they're at. So they would poison the carcass to kill the vultures that are there. And it's called sentinel poisoning because it kills the first ones, and then the other vultures are like, oh, I don't want to be there anymore. And our Lapat-faced vultures are often the first ones there because they possess one of the strongest beaks of any African vulture. You can see they've got a really big beak, and that makes it so that they are stronger, and they're able to get through really tough skin or to tear tendons that other vultures can't get into. So they're often the front line vultures that get in trouble with poachers a lot of the time because of that. They are also particularly susceptible to electrocution on energy infrastructure. That's starting to become more of an issue for Lapat-faced vultures in Africa. So it's just something we have to be a little, just keep in mind as infrastructure increases for this species. Another cool thing about our Lapat-faced vultures is that even though they are super tough and strong and they can get through all the tough meat, they also will eat termites, locusts, small mammals, and reptiles. So they're not obligate scavengers. Obligate scavenger means that's the only thing they are is scavengers, which a lot of our vultures are. But Lapat-faced vultures can branch out a little bit and eat smaller things, even with that really, really big beak. All right, our last old world vulture I want to talk about tonight is our Indian vulture. As the name suggests, once again, it is found mostly throughout India, and they are critically endangered with 90% decline in their population in the last 10 years. It's the most steep decline in vulture populations that's ever been recorded up to this point, along with the slender-billed vulture, which is in the same region as our Indian vultures. And this decline is due to, once again, poisoning, but it's a different type of poisoning. This one is from a drug that's an anti-inflammatory drug that's used to treat livestock. Indian vultures almost exclusively eat dead cattle in this area. It's mostly what's available to them. So they will eat the cattle once they die. They don't kill them. They wait till they die and then eat them. But the diclofenac is used as an anti-inflammatory in the livestock. Veterinarians prescribe it a lot of the time. And when vultures ingest diclofenac, it leads to renal failure and visceral gout in vultures, and it's almost 100% fatal. So this was discovered in like the late 90s, early 2000s. And in 2006, diclofenac was actually banned in Nepal and Pakistan, but it's still unfortunately used often. Vets still prescribe it. It's not well known that there's alternatives to it. So there does need to be a lot more education to be able to save our vulture species. The alternative is actually something you might have heard of because people use it. It's called meloxicam. And then there is another alternative called ketoprofen. And unfortunately, that one's also fatal to vultures. So we really want to plug the meloxicam and not ketoprofen or diclofenac. But it's a kind of an uphill battle at this point, and it is not looking great for our vultures. This is actually a really interesting case study on what happens in a region when vultures disappear, because there are so few vultures left within this region. A lot of disease has increased, a lot more predation by other scavengers has increased, including and that has also included dangerous interactions between humans and those predators, such as jaguars. There have been a lot more human interactions and attacks from jaguars because the vultures would get rid of the carrion faster, and now they're just lying around, and so it brings in animals who have time to come get them, which are often in more populated areas. A lot of diseases have risen, like tuberculosis, cholera, botulism, and so it is really important that we have our vultures around. This is a really good example of why vultures are important to have. And then Just another really fun little fact is that these guys nest on cliffs, and they don't reuse their nests, primarily because the young, as they get older, they slowly push the sticks off the cliff as they get larger. So by the time they fledge, there's no more nest left. So they have to start over next year when they build a new nest. All right. So there are lots more old world vultures, but I want to pause there. Does anybody have any questions about old world vultures before we dive in to new world vultures tonight? Nobody. All right. Well, oh, I see one. That's a good question. So the question is, the drug diclofenac was banned in Nepal and Pakistan. What about India? It has not, to my knowledge, been banned in India yet. It needs to be, because that is a really big issue for the vultures there. But it's still being fought pretty intensely by the people who use it. That was a good question. And unfortunately, diclofenac has also been starting to be used in Europe, and we're seeing similar declines in vulture populations in Europe too because of that. Who fills the niche for vultures in Australia? That's a great question that I'm not sure what the answer is there. They certainly have to have scavengers of some type, but I'm not sure who fills that role. That would be a very interesting thing to look into. Any other questions?
Kind of along that line, do you know why there's not vultures in Australia?
So I don't know for sure, but I'm sure it has, I believe it has something to do with just like evolutionary, how animals ended up where they are in Australia, so far removed that it just was far away from where all the other vultures were. But that is something I'm not super well versed on, so I don't want to speculate too much. Good questions though. Did somebody posted a thing in there? Cool. We'll have to look at that later. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the New World vultures. So New World vultures, just to review a little bit, are going to be the vultures found in the Americas, so North and South America. And there are 7 species of vultures in that group. We've got the California condor, Andean condor, king vulture, black vulture, turkey vulture, lesser-headed vulture, and the greater-headed vulture. Depending on who you ask, the lesser and greater-headed vulture, that was actually a very recent split into 2 species. So some people might even still recognize it as one. It was in the, I believe in the 90s when it was split. So it's still becoming accepted. And then you can see the king vulture there showing off some of its colors. It is the most colorful vulture of all of them. So it's got some really flashy colors, especially on its head. One question I often get is, what's the difference between a condor and a vulture? Essentially, condors are bigger, and that's pretty much it. Otherwise, there's still vultures. It's just a different name for big vultures. So there are, like I said, 7 species here, but I'm going to focus on the 3 that are found in the United States, which is going to be our turkey vulture, black vulture, and our California condor. So first, we're going to start with one of our most iconic and well spread or thoroughly dispersed vulture species, which is our turkey vulture. It's found throughout pretty much all of South America and a huge portion of North America. And that range continues to expand as climate change continues to warm more habitats. They are least concerned, and their populations are stable or increasing. One of the things that is most interesting about our turkey vultures is that they have an excellent sense of smell, and they actually use their sense of smell to locate their food, which is not true of most other vulture species. Most other vultures are going to be using their sense of eyesight because they have excellent sense of eyesight, and they do still have a sense of smell, but it's not as developed as our turkey vulture's sense of smell. They have one of the largest olfactory bulbs of any bird, and it's 4 times larger than the black vulture, which is the other vulture that we see often in the same regions as turkey vultures. So they are much better at finding things with their sense of smell. And then they also use their sense of eyesight because it's still really good, but they primarily rely on their sense of smell. And this has allowed them to be able to live in areas where other vultures have not been able to, mostly because they don't have to see under canopies to find their food. So they can be in really densely canopied areas and still be able to find food. With most vultures are going to be relying on open areas to find their food with their eyesight. They're actually able to detect molecules of a carcass from thousands of feet away up in the sky. They have also kind of developed a specialty for smaller carry-on items. And this is actually because of the way black vultures interact with them. Black vultures are much more aggressive and dominant to turkey vultures. So turkey vultures find the food and black vultures follow turkey vultures to the food, and then they chase the turkey vultures away. So turkey vultures have started to kind of specialize in eating small things like squirrels and small roadkill items, and they try and eat it as fast as they can before the black vultures get there to scare them away. And they have so many cool things about them. I'm just going to mention a couple, and this comic kind of gets to a couple of them. They've got lots of fun facts. That olfactory power that they use has actually been used a couple times to help locate natural gas leaks, because you can pump a smell into a natural gas and it will carry it. So if there's a natural gas leak that can't be located, they'll pump like a smell that's kind of like carry on into it, and vultures will circle around that spot looking for the carry on. And so it is a neat tool for people, but it also kind of makes it so that the turkey vultures waste energy. So I hope they get something out of it too in the end. But they have lots of cool adaptations. And one of them is projectile vomiting when they are afraid, as a defense mechanism, as somebody mentioned at the beginning. And what they do is they will gorge themselves when they're eating. So they'll eat as much as they possibly can. And they have like an extra pouch in there, like before it gets to their stomach, called a crop. And they'll store all of the food in there until they can fly away and digest it slowly later in a safer location. But if they are disturbed before they've been able to move the food from the crop into their stomach, they will projectile vomit it, usually trying to do it on whatever is bothering them, because it's a super effective defense mechanism to get something to leave you alone when it smells gross and it's super acidic. And it's just disgusting in general. It also makes them lighter, so it makes it easier for them to fly away and get away safely. The other cool adaptation that's mentioned in this comic is urohydrosis. Urohydrosis is when they defecate on their legs to help them cool themselves down, and actually serves two purposes. One is to cool themselves down, and the other is to actually clean their legs, because they're either urate. Urate is a combination of feces and urine, and they do both at the same time, so it's called urate. The urate is highly acidic. It's basically straight uric acid. So whatever else they've got, bacteria or anything on their legs, when they defecate on themselves, then it kills all of that bacteria and disease, so they don't have to worry about getting sick from what they're eating, which is very handy. Even though they eat gross things, they like to stay pretty clean. Another way they help clean themselves off is, you might notice a turkey vulture kind of sitting with its wings outstretched at some point in the sun often, and that is called the heraldic pose. They use it to help themselves warm up or dry off, but they also use it to help bake off bacteria from their feathers or anything gross on their feathers, so that they can be nice and clean. So they've got some really, really cool, they are very awesome. I agree with this comic very much. So that's a little bit about our turkey vulture friends. Their relatives are black vultures. And black vultures are not quite as widespread as turkey vultures, as you can see from this map here. But their range is increasing because they are adjusting faster to human impacted areas than other vultures are and other species are. And as climate change is impacting their available habitat, their range is also increasing. Their populations are stable, and their populations are often actually increasing in many places as well. So like I mentioned, they don't have as good olfactory sense, so they primarily use their sense of eyesight to follow turkey vultures to food. You can see our turkey vultures had really intense nostrils, and these guys don't really. You can actually see all the way through a turkey vulture's beak through their nostrils because they're so big, and that is not the case for a black vulture. So if you're close enough to see the beak, you can look at the nostril, and that can be a good way to identify them, but I'll get into that in a little bit too. Now, black vultures, as I mentioned, are much more aggressive, so they'll scare away turkey vultures, but they are also known for feeding in large groups. It's actually called a wake when vultures feed together, so which is very appropriate, I think. And so a wake of black vultures have been known to kill cattle that are vulnerable, that are either giving birth or sick. They particularly like placenta and afterbirth. So they will often target pregnant cows, and they can actually, it's pretty brutal because they can actually like bleed them to death by pecking them until they bleed, because what they'll do is they'll grab, twist, and pull. And so it's pretty intense. I have been bitten by a black vulture before, and it is not fun. So it's not a good way to go. But there's pretty limited data on how prevalent that issue is and how often black vultures are actually responsible for the death of the livestock. So further research is necessary to assess this threat and provide education on management practices that can keep them away if that is the case. But because of that, oftentimes farmers are not very keen about having vultures around. And I'll talk about some of the ways they keep them away in a little bit as well. They also will roost in communal sites. They will roost with turkey vultures, and the largest recorded roost has been over 4,000 altogether, and that was in Florida. But more commonly, the roosts are between 50 and 300 individuals in a roost. And they actually have so when they are eating, it's called a wake. When they're flying, it's called a kettle in a group. And when they are sitting, it's called a roost. When they're just playing around, or when they're together and for the night, it's called a roost. When they're just messing around, it's called loafing. So black vultures and turkey vultures are really intelligent. And so sometimes they just play around and mess with things and just destroy things for fun. They've been known to rip windshield wipers off of things or take caulking out of things. So some people don't love vultures because of that, but it is just their curiosity and their intelligence that's making them want to know what's going on around them. So you can't really blame them for that too much. All right. So since these two are often in the same area, they can be confused for each other. So I just want to go over how you can identify the two of them a little bit. So our turkey vultures are the two on top of the screen here, and our black vultures are on the bottom. So first of all, you want to look at the wings. You can see with our turkey vulture, they have kind of a tannish white that goes all the way to their body, from the tips of the wings to their body. And then our black vulture has just these white tips on their wings. I will say this picture makes this tan look really, really obvious. Sometimes it's just like a dark tan color, but the black vulture's white tips is always like a bright silvery white. So that's a good way to look. You can also tell that our black vultures have a broader wing and a shorter, broader tail. So sometimes this shape actually looks like one big shape. It almost looks like the tail blends in with the wings when it's spread out all the way. So that's a pretty good way to tell them apart when they're flying. Whereas our turkey vulture has this really long tail that sticks out far from their wings. Turkey vultures also fly in a V shape. And this is actually, they spend most of their time at lower altitudes, and you'll notice that they'll be wobbly when they fly, or they'll teeter. And that is actually them adjusting to different air streams, and so that they don't have to flap. They don't have to use as much energy to help them stay at low altitudes. Whereas our black vulture flaps almost compulsively. So they're like flap, 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 soar, flap, 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 soar. And usually it's 3 or 4 flaps, and then they soar a little bit. So it is a pretty distinctive flying style between the two. That takes some practice to look into, but if you know what you're looking for, then you can see it. They also have different head colors. So looking at the seated ones here, Our turkey vulture has the bright red head, and our black vulture has like this dark gray head, which is part of how they got their names. But the immature or young turkey vultures also have a gray head. So the thing you want to look for is the beak. The turkey vulture has this ivory beak, whereas the black vulture is always going to have like a grayish beak. A young turkey vulture will have a black or gray tip on their beak, but it still has ivory. And as they get older, it'll turn more ivory. So that's one of the identifying features. And then you can see this picture, you can see all the way through that nostril. That is only true of our turkey vultures and not our black vultures. So that's another way that you can look. Their turkey vultures are also slightly larger. Their wingspan's about 6 feet, whereas our black vulture is about 5.5 feet. But again, that's hard to tell unless you have experience or they're right next to each other. They do weigh about the same though, so they're not significantly different from each other in that area. All right, before I move on to our California condor, does anybody have any questions about turkey vultures or black vultures? That was a lot.
So Kira, there was a question put in the chat going back to the cattle, about why they were given anti-inflammatory drugs.
That's a good question, and I'm not a vet, so I'm not entirely sure, but I do know that it helps with like arthritis or joint pain. So if a cow is getting older, that can often be used for that, but there might be other uses that I'm not familiar with either. All right, any questions about our turkey vulture, black vultures? Well, if you have them, keep typing them in there. I'll keep going, but Julia, feel free to stop me if any pop up. All right, so California condor is the last New World vulture I wanted to talk about a little bit. California condors have a much smaller range. They're only in those tiny little spots in California and a little bit in that kind of the 3 states there, and then down into Mexico and the Baja Peninsula there. So California condors are the largest of all of the North American vultures. It's currently the largest soaring land bird on the continent. In the Pleistocene age, there are Territorns that were much larger, but now our California condor reigns supreme in that area. These guys are exclusively carrion feeders. So that means they are obligate scavengers. All they eat is dead stuff. They don't kill anything else. They don't eat any supplemental food. It's all dead mammals, mostly large mammals that they're going to be eating. And they also eat in a highly social manner. So you would not often see one eating by themselves. There's usually going to be more than one when they eat. They have many superficial similarities to the Griffin vultures of the old world. They have similar foot structures and heads and necks. They feed the young in the same way, and they have equal nesting duties between males and females, which is similar to the Griffins. But unlike Griffins, they don't build substantial nests, but they rely on natural cave structures, and they're the only vulture species that really relies on cave structures. So they'll find caves as their nests, and they don't really build much in there. They also have single egg clutches, and it takes a minimum of 6 years for a juvenile to reach sexual maturity. That's why it's been so hard for their population to bounce back. From the mid-1980s, there were only 27 condors left in the world, and it has taken a lot of work to get them to rebound. They're still critically endangered. And in the mid-1980s, the last 27 were captured, and they started a reproduction and reintroduction program with them in partnership with the San Diego Zoo. And they've been reintroducing our California condors to the wild since 1992. It's been mostly successful, but it's still not considered self-sustaining because they are continuing to be poisoned. That's their main threat. And it's a different type of poisoning. It's lead poisoning. So lead poisoning comes from bullets that are lead that are shot into animals from hunters, and the bullets will fragment, and the hunters often leave that behind, which then condors eat, and it causes lead poisoning, which is almost 100% fatal to the condors. And since that is like all they are eating, it is very hard for them to avoid it. So as of December 2021, 537 condors were recorded with a wild population of 334 and a captive population of 203. But they are not ready to like stop doing the reintroduction until we can really address the issue of the lead poisoning, because their populations are still really struggling to come back from the poisoning issues that they are encountering. All right. Does anyone have any questions about condors before I move on? Or about our black or turkey vultures? Because I know now you might have had time to add that in there. Again, Julia, feel free to stop me. I'm going to keep going so we don't run out of time tonight.
But we got someone typing a chat or question in the chat, so you may have a question shortly.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. So why do we need vultures? That's kind of the whole thing about this, is virtues of vultures. So why do we need them? There's one of the main things is they're our cleanup crew. They are kind of like the vacuum cleaners of the earth. They're getting rid of carrion quickly before diseases can spread. So they reduce the amount of food available for other scavengers, such as flies, rodents, stray dogs, and large cats like jaguars in India, like I talked about earlier. They also help with disease control. Their stomach is extremely acidic. It's more acidic than like battery acid on the acidity scale. It's between a 0 and a 1. It's very intense. It's the most acidic stomach that's found in any vertebrate animal, as far as we know. And it has a special enzyme that allows them to digest diseases like anthrax, tuberculosis, botulism, cholera, and rabies, among many others. So they are going to help get rid of those diseases for us so they don't spread. They also help with nutrient cycling. They can travel over 125 miles in a day, and they can spread nutrients over a wide area in that process of traveling. So what are their primary dangers? It depends on where they're at in the world, but all vultures are going to face poisoning of some type, electrocution from energy infrastructure. Wind energy turbines are becoming an increasing risk as they start to increase the production of those. Human disturbance, whether it's poaching, habitat degradation, livestock protection, nest disturbance, collisions from vehicles or aircrafts. Now in Africa, the main issues are going to be poisoning through baiting, belief-based or sentinel poisoning, habitat degradation, and decline in food availability because of human interference, and belief-based traditional medicine. In Asia and Europe, it's going to be poisoning, but mostly from diclofenac, and human disturbance from habitat degradation and livestock protection, as well as collisions with planes and vehicles. And in America, we've got lead poisoning from bullets, and trapping and shooting, human disturbance of nesting and roosting sites, collisions with planes and vehicles are going to be a big one. Turkey vultures are actually considered the single largest threat for military aircraft in the United States. The U.S. Air Force actually between 1989 and 1992 spent $21.6 million from turkey vulture collisions on their aircrafts, and that has only increased. So they have spent a considerable amount of money looking into ways to keep vultures away from their airfields, and that is what I'm going to talk about next, actually. So that was part of my master's project, was looking at vulture deterrence. So people want vultures to stay away from things for lots of reasons. One is that they often spend a lot of time roosting on communication towers, water towers, around airfields and agricultural fields. And it is because they like bare structures. It helps them see easier. It helps them get lift when they take off to fly. So they like to have those tall, bare structures, and we just keep providing really, really great things for them. So the reason people don't want them on those towers is because their feces or their defecation is acidic, and it can corrode metals on the towers over time, which is a problem for safety reasons, for sure. And then for airfields, it can cause lots of damage to the aircrafts, and it can be dangerous fatally to people if they're hit in a certain way, or too many of them at once. And then agricultural fields, they want to keep them away from their cows because of black vultures' propensity to prey on pregnant or sick cows. So there's lots of reasons people want to keep them away. Another one that I don't think is as legitimate is that people don't like having vultures around, lots of vultures, because they think they're morbid. That's where that's not so great, because vultures are awesome. They just are misunderstood. So there's lots of different deterrent strategies to keep vultures away. And what I looked at literature reviews and lots of different scientific studies, and I looked at the most effective forms of deterrence, and these were the 3 most effective. So we've got taxidermy effigy, which is a dead vulture that was taxidermied, a decoy effigy, which is a synthetic or plastic material of some type, and bird spikes. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to see what the public perception was on all of these. Typically, people didn't like any of them, but the one that was the most accepted was a decoy effigy. Taxidermy effigies often were seen as macabre, or just people didn't like it because they also deteriorate, and you can see that it's a real bird. It's not great. And then bird spikes are often perceived as hurting birds, which they don't really. There's a lot of misconception about that, but that's how people perceive them. And their vultures are also a little too smart for bird spikes because they'll bend them so they can sit on them. So they're not as effective as the effigies are. We don't entirely know why effigies work, but they have to be very specific for them to work to keep vultures away. They have to hang upside down. They can't be tangled in anything. So this one on the first one actually probably wouldn't work because it's too close to this. But they, if they're not like that, vultures will destroy it, or they will, they won't care about it. So it has to be very specific to keep vultures away. And we believe they think it's just like an omen. They're like, this isn't safe for vultures. And so then they leave, and they don't typically adjust to it. Like a lot of other deterrents, vultures kind of just get used to over time. So it's very interesting that people want to keep vultures away so much. So I think a lot of education needs to happen about why vultures are important, and maybe looking into other methods to keep vultures off of towers, like maybe some sort of paint that can not corrode with their acid feces. So how can you help vultures? There's lots of fun things you can do. So one of them is actually to just tell people about vultures and how important they are, how awesome they are. There are some pretty cool social vultures you can follow on social media if you do that. There's a vulture from Tracy Aviary called Andean Condor, which is an Andean condor. Really fun to follow. There's George the turkey vulture from the American Eagle Foundation, and Bash the black vulture from the American Eagle Foundation. It kind of just gives you a different perspective on a vulture's life, and can show you how fun and cool they are. So I recommend doing that. I get a lot of fun out of following those vultures. And then you can also support AZA facilities. AZA are Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And so not all zoos and aquariums are created alike. AZA facilities have to have really stringent protocols and be very excellent in their facilities and their care of animals to be able to be accredited. And as part of an AZA institution, they have to do conservation. And a lot of their money has to go towards that. So one of the programs is called Saving Animals from Extinction, or SAFE, and they focus on African vultures because of that huge decline in vultures in Africa. They actually have a group that partners with the North Carolina Zoo, the Denver Zoo, an organization called Vulpro, Kalahari Research and Conservation Center, and the Peregrine Fund. And those organizations work with they get money from the AZA. So whenever you visit a zoo or an aquarium that's AZA, a portion of your ticket sale will go towards conservation that helps with satellite telemetry, learning where these vultures are going, training rangers to reduce poisoning, awareness building, population and breeding, colony monitoring, and breeding programs to build up those populations. So it's a really easy, fun way for you to support vultures, is just visiting a local zoo or aquarium that is AZA accredited. Another thing you can do is, if you are a hunter or if you know a hunter, tell them to use copper bullets. They are a great alternative to lead bullets. They work the same, do everything the same, except they are safer for the hunter and for the people because you're not worried about getting any lead pieces in your food too. And it is good for not just vultures, any other scavenger. It's also an issue for bald eagles a lot too. So it's a good alternative. And then you can also celebrate International Vulture Awareness Day. This is the first Saturday of September every year. And a lot of places, environmentally inclined places, will celebrate it. So there's often some really cool things you can do. And it's just a really fun way to celebrate vultures and to learn more about them. Because I am a big proponent of learning more about them, then you'll start to really appreciate them, at least respect them, and hopefully learn to love them. And you can always also tell your local government about your commitment to vultures as well with all of their policies that they may be doing. All right, that was a lot of information. Thank you so much for having me today, and I am happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. I also, just real quick, that's my literature cited and my photo credits. Yes.
So we do have a couple of questions that have popped up in our chat. The first one is, and you kind of touched base a bit on this, but do the folks working with condors have ideas of ways to limit the lead intake?
Yeah, a lot of it is education based and switching hunters over to copper bullets. There's just, for some reason, a very big resistance to that. I think copper bullets are slightly more expensive, and that might be part of it, but a lot of it is just an awareness campaign and teaching people to switch to copper bullets instead of lead bullets.
Yeah. Next question is, have there been any studies looking into the effects of depleted uranium for vultures in Iraq and Afghanistan?
I don't know. I have not heard anything about that in my studies. That's a very interesting question. I certainly will have to look into it myself. If you have more information on that, I'd love to know more.
All right, next question is, why doesn't the acid in their poop burn their legs?
Great question. So they have very thick skin on their feet. That's just, they're built to withstand it, and with dirt, what's the word I'm looking for? Endure it. So it's also not on their legs long enough to really make an impact, because they also bathe quite often as part of their like eating gross stuff. They want to be clean, so as soon as they can, they're gonna take a bath somewhere. It's a good question.
And then how have the vultures been impacted by the avian influenza?
Oh, great question. So the avian influenza, or the avian flu, is spread primarily through feces of infected birds. So they can be passed from bird to bird, especially if they roost in the same area. That's why it's so common in chickens and geese and things that are farmed together, because they can't really avoid that the poop from one another. So it does often impact vultures. I know there was actually, where I live in Fuquay, there was a recent vulture, like 50 vultures were found dead. And they believe it was the avian influenza. So luckily, black vultures and turkey vultures have really good populations and stable populations in the United States. So I don't think it's going to make a huge impact for their populations overall, but it still is going to it's still going to affect them somehow. And it will probably affect black vultures more than turkey vultures, since turkey vultures tend to be a little bit more of loners.
What is the typical home range for the turkey and black vultures?
So they are going to be primarily throughout. I can go back to our range picture, the range pictures, but our turkey vultures are almost all in South America and almost all of North America up through Canada. They're not as common in Canada. They don't like the cold as much, but they are going to be more widespread. Black vultures are starting to creep up into different portions of the United States, but they go all the way into South America and up. They're all the way up the eastern coast of the United States, but they haven't quite expanded across the middle or the western part of the United States yet. But they would be all over North Carolina. Both of them would. All right. Any other questions?
I think we got another question coming up in the chat.
Cool. or if you have any follow-up questions from the questions you already asked.
All right, so are they nomadic, or would we be seeing the same individuals year after year?
That's a good question. Both black and turkey vultures are migratory, so they are going to be moving during the seasons, but you will still see those populations year round. It's just that the ones that you're seeing in the winter came down from further north, and the ones that you're seeing in the summer came up from further south. So you're seeing the same species all year, but it's probably not the same individuals you're seeing all year.
And you had mentioned that the Griffin ones shared nest duties. So is that unique for vultures, or is it kind of species to species differs?
So most of the griffins, so like griffins in the old world, and then our California condor and our Andean condor, they're both going to share nest duties, whereas in like black vultures and turkey vultures, not as much. It's mostly going to be they're also very interesting with their nesting because they don't really build a nest so much. They might just even just lay an egg on the ground in like an area that's kind of blocked off. And then they do protect their nest, but it's more the female doing most of it.
Do they mate for life?
That is a good question, and I do not know the answer to that. I know a lot of avians are monogamous and for life, but I don't know about turkey vultures or vultures in general. That's a good question. I'll have to look into that answer. Great questions tonight.
We got lots of great questions coming through tonight. Yeah. All right. So we had someone someone point out that the vultures are really cool.
Yeah, they are.
All right. Well, we have 8 o'clock now. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I really appreciate you guys taking time out of your evening to join us for this. I know for me, I've learned a lot. This was super fascinating.
Yeah, I could talk about it a lot longer. They're real cool.
Anyone that is seeking EE, I will be sending out that form later this week for those that you need that credit. Again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We hope you join us again next month for our next lecture.
Thanks,
Have
everyone.
a great night, everyone.
Bye.